It is really incredible to be here and to have been at all of these national conferences on media reform, how critical they are. Because the media can be the greatest force for peace in the world. Independent media can be. A media that's not brought to us by the weapons manufacturers when we deal with war, not brought to us by the insurance companies and big pharma when we cover the healthcare debate, not brought to us by the oil, gas, coal, or nuclear industries when we're dealing with global warming. From global warming to global warring, we need an independent media in this country that is vibrant, that is linking together the low-power FM movement, the public access TV movement in this country, NPR, Pacifica, PBS, as well as the independent satellite networks, like, well, the network that has been broadcasting this entire conference, Free Speech TV, that we are so proud to be broadcast on channel 9415, on Dish Network, channel 348 on DirecTV, as well as Link TV as well on both networks. We need independent media. It is absolutely critical. I have just flown in this week from Minneapolis. I was there along with my Democracy Now! Colleagues, Nicole Salazar and Sharif Abdel-Quddus, who did such an incredible job covering the uprising in Egypt. But we were there for another reason. We were being deposed by police attorneys because we have sued the Twin Cities police and the federal authorities for our arrests at the Republican convention. It happened on September 1st, on Labor Day, 2008. It was a beautiful blue sky morning, the first day of the Republican convention, and we were out doing our jobs, like so many reporters that day. The first event of the day was a mass anti-war protest led by soldiers who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and those who were refusing to go, some in full uniform at great risk, leading thousands of civilians from St. Paul City Hall to the Excel Center, saying no to war. I then went to the convention center for the convention to begin, and my colleagues Sharif and Nicole went back to St. Paul Neighborhood Network, SPNN, where we were broadcasting for the week our 2-hour daily specials to begin to digitize the tape and do the work of the day. And they heard a commotion outside, and they did what they were there to do. They did their jobs. Nicole picked up her camera, Sharif took the microphone, and they raced outside. They saw the riot police, they saw the protesters, and Nicole started filming in a big parking lot. And the riot police came at her. As she held up her press pass and shouted, "Press, press," she continued to film, not expecting to film her own violent arrest. But the riot police would not stop. They were shouting, "On your face, on your face." They were telling her to move. She was against parked cars. She said, "Where?" And they took her down on her face. And as they had a knee or boot in her back and her face was in the ground, they were pulling on her leg, which bloodied her face. And the first thing they did when her camera tumbled down was remove the battery, if you were wondering what it was they didn't want her to do. Sharif raced over, telling the police to calm down, and they threw him up against the wall, kicked him twice in the chest, bloodying and scarring his arm, and arresting him as well. They face PC felony riot charges, probable cause felony riot. I got the call from my colleague here tonight, senior producer Mike Burke. I was on the convention floor interviewing delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. And he said, "Come quickly. Sharif and Nicole have been arrested. We think they've been hurt." So I raced with Rick Rowley of Big Noise Films, fantastic journalist who has been covering Iraq and Afghanistan now for years, who together with Jackie Suin has done the incredible films from Zapatista to Fourth World War. We raced down the streets of St. Paul to 7th and Jackson, and all I did was go up to the police line, honoring the police line, not trying to pass it, demanding to speak to a commanding officer so I could have my accredited colleagues released, as they could see I was, because I had all my credentials on to be on the convention floor that allows me to interview presidents and vice presidents and delegates. And I simply said, "I want to speak to your commanding officer." They ripped me through the line, twisted my arms back, slapped the handcuffs on, threw me up against the wall onto the ground. I pleaded with them, don't arrest me. I just want my colleagues released. Well, we were all charged. Eventually, because of, I'm sure, many of you, and people all over the country, because the YouTube video of our arrest went immediately online, thousands of people were calling, tweeting, faxing, emailing in, we were released. Sharif was taken out of the cell even before the AP photographer. 40 reporters, at least, were arrested that week, along with hundreds of people who were protesting everything to war, from war to poverty in the streets of St. Paul. When I was taken to, after being freed, back to the convention to be interviewed by the networks, I was in the NBC skybox, and after I finished an interview, an NBC reporter came up and said, how come I wasn't arrested? I said, were you covering the protest outside? He said, no. And I said, well, that's the thing, I'm not being arrested in the skybox either, right? 90% of life, as Woody Allen says, is just showing up, and that is our job, to cover the convention floor, to speak to the delegates, to get into those corporate suites, to see who's sponsoring the Republican convention, who's sponsoring the Democratic convention in Denver, and to get out into the streets where the uninvited guests are, where thousands of people gather who are not going to be able to get inside, who also have something important to say, because democracy is a messy thing. It's our job to capture it all, and we shouldn't have to get a record when we try to put things on the record. The response of the police chief from St. Paul the next day when I went to cover his news conference, Police Chief Harrington, when I described to him what happened to Nicole and Sharif, how they'd been bloodied, how they'd been arrested, and why all three of us ended up in jail. I said to him, what have you instructed your police to do, and how do you expect us to operate in this environment? He responded, we could embed with the mobile field force, the police mobile field force. Is this what reporting has come to in this country? Are they using the model of how reporters embed themselves in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan as the model for how we should cover American cities, politics, celebrations of democracy like conventions are supposed to be? Is that what this has come to? Because the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. If you look at what happens when you're embedded in the front lines of troops, you're sleeping with the soldiers, you're eating with the soldiers, your life is in their hands. How do you expect you're going to cover the war? If you're going to have that kind of embedding, you need reporters embedded in Iraqi hospitals and Afghan communities and the peace movement around the world to understand the full effects of war. And it's not only a problem being embedded in the front lines of troops. I'm certainly not saying reporters aren't brave when they do that, but you're getting one perspective. The deepest problem is being embedded in the establishment here in this country. We have a special role to play. My brother and I wrote a book called Static, and the reason we called it this, and in this high-tech digital age, in this time of high-def television and digital radio, still all we get is static, this veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Which is why I want to dedicate Democracy Now!'s presence here this weekend, and all my wonderful colleagues who are here, to Manning Marable, who we lost last week, this wonderful scholar who, on the day that his book was to be published, 3 days before he died, who wrote the book Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, who teaches us deeply about what movements mean, because I think that's why we are here this weekend. We need a media democracy movement that follows on the traditions of the great movements in the history of this country. He tells the story of A. Philip Randolph, the greatest organizer of the 20th century, who organized the 1963 March on Washington, who organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who was brought to meet with FDR by Eleanor Roosevelt, and who, when he described the condition of black people in this country, the condition of working people in this country, FDR responded to him, "I don't disagree with anything you've said, but you've got to make me do it. Make me do it." What a lesson for today. As we move into the next election in 2012, as we gather here on Friday and learn that the House passed a resolution that says they will not support net neutrality as 3,000 people gather here in Boston. As we see an FCC that unfortunately has not followed through on Obama's promise and the FCC chair's promise to stand with net neutrality, to reinforce it. Well, I think we have to remember what FDR told A. Philip Randolph. In fact, it's something that President Obama, when he was running for president, said to a questioner when he was in the backyard of a New Jersey home answering questions of people who might support him. And someone asked him about the Middle East, and they said, "What are you going to do about it?" And he told the A. Philip Randolph story and repeated what FDR said, "Make me do it. Make me do it." Your job here, leaving this weekend, is really answering that challenge of how you think the media should be able to operate in this country, of what it means to build independent media, to build an internet that is open and free for all. It's the answer to corporate globalization, grassroots globalization all over the world. We see the importance of that free and open internet when universally Mubarak was condemned for hitting the kill switch on the cell phones and the internet in Egypt, which is, well, reminding me how important it was that we had independent media on the ground. Sharif Abdel-Quddus, you couldn't have had finer, more eloquent reporting, bringing you this extremely personal yet epic, historic struggle of the people in the streets in Egypt, from Sharif's incredible perspective as a son of Egypt himself. As he landed in Egypt, coming from New York, from Democracy Now!, he figured out a way to get around the internet shutdown. And he tweeted out, "No matter what happens here in Egypt, this will never be Mubarak's Egypt again." Yes, Sharif became one of the top tweeters in the world. We call it trickle-up journalism, being cited on CNN and Al Jazeera and MSNBC, all the networks, his reports, as the network anchors were reporting from their hotel rooms with lower thirds that said, "Reporting from an undisclosed location." Sharif was broadcasting from Tahrir and saying it proudly. And his reports, 20 and 25-minute reports that were sent through the internet by his fellow Egyptian American, Hani Massoud, our videographer who was with him, who leaps tall buildings in a single bound, getting those 25-minute reports to Democracy Now! To broadcast to millions of people all over the world so you could hear people speaking for themselves. That's the power of independent media. Because when you hear young Mona Al-Saif, the activist, or Nawal Saadawi, the great 79-year-old Egyptian feminist, or Noha Radwan, the UC Davis professor, Egyptian-American, who raced home to be in Tahrir and was beaten by the thugs but went right back to Tahrir the next day, when you know their names, their stories, their families, you care. And it makes it much harder to target them. Whether we're talking about young Egyptian activists, older writers, or an aunt in Afghanistan, a child in Palestine, a grandmother in Israel. You say there must be another way. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. Anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country who can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that will determine whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. I just want to end from the Middle East to the Midwest. In the Middle East, we have to understand how it is these despots remain for so many decades. The questions Western pundits asked, those people in Washington on all the networks who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. These despots remained because they had a coat of armor. Mubarak, $2 billion a year from the United States, a coat of armor made in the USA, one of the few things that is still made in the USA. $2 billion a year. Most of that money going to the weapons manufacturers, from General Dynamics to Raytheon to Lockheed Martin to Boeing. We have to be able to tell this story because the people on the ground in Egypt, in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Tunisia, they understand it. And we need a media that bridges the gap so we can understand. We come from the trigger end. They're at the target end. And we need a media that bridges so we can all understand and participate in a global discussion about how we want to live in a global world. I just want to end with the words of Karim Amr, or the blog of Karim Amr. He's a great young Egyptian blogger who was in prison for 4 years, got out, was in Tahrir, and before we knew it, he was disappeared again. As Sharif would report, we'd ask him, where is Karim Amr? And he said, we don't know at this point. Eventually, right before Mubarak fell, he was released from a desert jail. But my colleague Dennis Moynihan and I, when we were writing the column that week, we went to Karim's blog, and it's dedicated to Hans and Sophie Scholl, this young Egyptian blogger, dedicating his blog to Hans and Sophie Scholl, a brother and sister who formed the White Rose Collective in Germany in World War II. They thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians, but they knew they wanted to expose, to ensure that Germans would never be able to say they didn't know. And so together with their professor and other workers, they started to publish pamphlets because information is power. They published 6 pamphlets on all. On the 4th pamphlet was written the words, "We will not be silent." They passed these out under cover of night. They dropped them in an alley, in a market, in a classroom, and eventually they were caught by the Gestapo. They were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!